And then to finish up this lesson, we have two more definitions to consider. The interquartile range is the difference between the first and third quartiles. We represent interquartile range with IQR, and we always take the larger value minus the smaller value. And that's our interquartile range, Q3 minus Q1. An outlier is an extremely high or extremely low data value when we compare it to the other data values in the set. And it turns out we have two ways to determine outliers. The first way is dealing with quartiles. If the value is smaller than Q1 minus 1.5 times our interquartile range, or larger than Q3 plus 1.5 times our interquartile range. Alternatively, we can determine outliers by calculating the z-score and seeing if the z-score is greater than 3 or less than -3. So if a data value is more than 3 standard deviations away from the mean, it's considered an outlier. Or if it's outside this 1.5 times the interquartile range, away from our Q1 or Q3. These two different ways to determine outliers may not result in the same conclusion, depending on our data set. So one may tell us, yes, this is an outlier, and the other may tell us, no, it's not. And we just have to use discretion and our best judgment. Generally, we would use the first way with the quartiles if we know all our data or we know the quartiles. The second way with the z-score we would use if we know the mean and the standard deviation, which we could also get if we know all of our data values. So again, which way we use is going to depend on what information we're given or what information we can obtain from the situation. Let's take a look at our statistics class test scores again and see if we can determine any outliers. So here's our data, our statistics test data, and I'm just going to calculate the minimum of our data set and then our 3 quartiles and our maximum. So A1 to K4. I'm using that quartile.exe to get, oh, I forgot my quartile, quartile 1. I like using the median function because then I don't have to tell it what quartile. A1, K4, quartile.exe, A1 to K4, and I'm doing quartile 3, and then our maximum, 101. Okay, so 17.5 is our minimum, 101 is our maximum, our median is 52, and then we have our Q1 and our Q2 there as well. To find our interquartile range, we have to do Q3 minus Q1. So I'm going to take Q3, I'm going to use cell references, so I'll click on Q3 minus, click on Q1, and we get 42.5. Then I take 1.5 times the interquartile range. So 1.5 times our interquartile range, and then we're going to calculate Q1 minus that, and Q3 plus that. So Q1, we're looking for below Q1, which Q1 is 35.5 minus 1.5 times our IQR. We're just going to click on it. It's going to give us a negative number, so there are no values there that are small outliers. And then for Q3, 78 plus 1.5 IQR. Oh, wrong cell reference there. Plus our 1.5 times IQR. 141, no. Our biggest value is 101, so we have no values outside of this range from -28 to 141. All of our values are between those two numbers, so we have no outliers if we're using quartiles. Let's see what would happen if we used the z-score, just to see the difference. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do, I have all of my data in this first column. I'm going to arrange my data, mostly because I think it'll be a little bit easier to look at. So I'll arrange my data. I need to find the mean, so we'll type in average and select our data. And then we'll type our standard deviation. And select our data again. And I forgot my .s for sample. And we have our mean and our standard deviation. Now, to calculate the z-score, we're going to take the value minus the mean, and I'm going to lock this cell reference with $signs, and then divide by our standard deviation that will also be locked. So looking at that formula, value minus our mean divided by our standard deviation. Now once I have that formula in with cell references, I'm going to grab that handle and drag it all the way down. And I look here, and my values are -1.5 z-score, so I am 1.5 times the standard deviation below my mean for that 17.5. And then if I come up to 101, I'm 1.7 times the standard deviation above the mean. None of these values are more than 3 standard deviations away from our mean, so none of these values are outliers. So even though we had no outliers to identify, that would be the process. First, calculating if we're talking quartiles, calculating our interquartile range with quartiles, and then finding that Q1 minus 1.5 IQR, Q3 plus 1.5 IQR. These values here are our extreme values in the data set. Anything beyond those values on either side, so less than the -28 and greater than the 141, those would be considered outliers. Or if we're talking z-scores, if any of these z-scores were smaller than -3 or larger than +3, those would be considered outliers.